Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think I'll wait just one more moment or two for a few more people to arrive. Welcome, everyone. Tonight's event is being hosted by the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Lehman Center for American History, and Columbia University Press. I am Ty Jones, curator for American History at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Hubert Harrison died at the age of 44 on December 17, 1927, almost exactly 107 years ago. For many of those years, his legacy was nearly lost. His name was no longer cited along with other leaders of the African-American freedom struggle with whom he had argued and debated during his life. But Harrison's importance, his merit, his impact, and his potential was clear to his contemporaries. Historian Joel A. Rogers in the 1940s described Harrison as perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his time and one of America's greatest minds, saying no one worked more seriously and indefatigably to enlighten his fellow men. The labor and civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph described him as the father of Harlem Radicalism. The editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper explained that Garvey, like the rest of us, followed Hubert Harrison. The historian Robert A. Hill referred to him as the ideological mentor to what was known as the New Negro Movement. Arturo Schomburg, speaking at Harrison's funeral, stated simply, "He came ahead of his time." But you cannot discuss Hubert Harrison without also giving due credit to Dr. Jeffrey B. Perry, who has almost single-handedly, and maybe he would dispute that or complicate that, over the course of the past 40 years, ensured that Hubert Harrison's legacy be restored to its rightful place. He is the author of the definitive 2-volume biography. Volume 1, Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918, was published in 2008. And Volume 2, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927, also by Columbia University Press, was just published this past week. We're also joined tonight by Brent Hayes Edwards, Pang Family Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Professor Edwards is the author, editor, and translator of numerous award-winning works on African-American literature, history, poetry, and music. He collaborated with Jean-Christophe Cloutier on the publication of a scholarly edition of a long-lost novel by Claude McKay, Amiable with Big Teeth, which was discovered among the manuscripts in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And he also teaches the groundbreaking seminar, Black Radicalism in the Archives, which immerses students in the archival papers of Hubert Harrison, Alexander Gumby, C.L.R. James, Amiri Baraka, Yuri Kochiyama, and others in the RBML collection. Dr. Perry, Professor Edwards, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Ty.
Thank you.
So Jeff, you've been researching and writing about Hubert Harrison for nearly 40 years. And in that time, through your work, you've rescued him, I would say, from historical anonymity almost. I mean, he wasn't forgotten. People who had known him and others wrote and spoke about him for decades after his death. But I think it would be useful today to begin with a short summary of his life story, his career, and his political and literary contributions.
Oh, sure, and then later on we'll talk about the background. But very briefly, for those who are not familiar with Hubert Harrison, he's born on St. Croix to an immigrant Barbadian mother, plantation worker. and a born enslaved plantation worker, a Crucian born enslaved plantation working father. And he spends his first 17 years in St. Croix. And he lives on the on Estate Concordia, and then in the Watergut section, very poor section of Christiansted, very poor. And but despite these circumstances, he reads whenever he can. He goes into the church library and has access to some books. He studies under a fellow named Wilfred Jackson, who's the father of D. Hamilton Jackson. And I'm mentioning some of this because a few days ago, I had the opportunity to be on radio down in St. Croix, and there's tremendous growing interest in St. Croix, justifiably in Hubert Harrison, you know, now with these materials available. And in the book, I make it a point to list a lot of the Crucians and Virgin Islanders are in there. So he spends his first 17 years in St. Croix. And I do some comparisons with the situation in volume 1 between St. Croix and the US, how the color line is drawn, et cetera. But when he comes to the US, he follows his sister, a pattern that many other Crucians had, that a female led the way, oftentimes in the family. And he's living in what were considered the meanest tenements in New York on the West 60s. And he starts going to school. He had only gone up to about 8th grade in St. Croix. And a headline was "Genius Found in West Indian Student." That was around 1902, 1903, one of the New York dailies. They hadn't seen anybody quite like him. He's barely going to school, and he's getting citywide honors and a Latin, you know, a leader in Latin. And he's doing that, and he's working days and part-times at night. But he's also involving over the next few years in a number of very important intellectual circles. One is he starts interacting with people like Arthur Schomburg and J.E. Bruce and George Young. There were some lyceums around 53rd, 54th Street. This is before the train started going up to Harlem and everything like this. So that was one of the areas where people would meet, and West Indians or Caribbeans, people from the US would come and they get together. And one thing Harrison commented on is in that atmosphere, people could discuss things openly and freely, you know, disagree, but they'd be friends afterwards. It was a wonderful, stimulating intellectual atmosphere. Another thing he did in those early years, he was a postal worker after 1907, at least through 1911, when he was fired through the efforts of Booker T. Washington, which is a story I document. But he worked a night shift, and I was a former postal worker for 33 years, so I related to his story very much. And he talked about getting off that night shift, usually, which ended for us at least at 11 or 3 in the morning or something, and meeting with other postal workers in somebody's apartment and discussing things and corresponding with activists in Cuba, you know, where the Independent Black Party was forming, or various things like this. And amongst those he interacted with was Charles Burroughs. And the Burroughs family is later famous or well-known because Charles Burroughs' son and his wife co-founded DuSable Museum in Chicago, right? Where you are right now. So there's a little history there. But so Harrison's, you know, and then he gets involved in the free thought movement in this early period. In free thought is thought unfettered by religion. This is a major break because Black church is the most powerful institution in the Black community. But Harrison reads a lot of the scripture and the literature, and he's not buying it, you know. And he documents this in his diary, which is one of the documents you threw up there and is very important. One thing I want to say about my volume 2 is when I wrote the volume, it's very big, but the notes are also very long. But in the notes, I have links to primary sources wherever I can, including much of the work which Ty and his cohorts have put up at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia. So when I talk about Harrison's diary, I will throw the link right to where what I'm quoting from is coming from. And interestingly, in the 20s, when he's doing book reviews, you get his thoughts on a certain book, but then you can get a link to a book that might be at Hathi Trust or someplace like this where it has some permanence. I tried to always find links that had some permanence. So this is, although I'm old, this was like a 21st century approach to writing history a little bit, I thought. So Harrison is involved free thought. And when he gets fired from the post office in 1911 for writing some comments critical of Booker T. Washington, who goes to Europe and basically says things are fine back home, Harrison takes issue with that. Du Bois also took issue with that. In the beginning, Harrison thought he considered himself a Du Bois man, and he liked Du Bois's leadership. He also developed some early criticisms of Du Bois, which I document. But Harrison then joins the Socialist Party, and he pours heart and soul into the socialists. He's speaking as many as 23 times a week outdoors, before 50,000 people at Union Square. He goes to speak on socialism at Broad and Wall Street in 1911, starting at 1 o'clock and going till the bell rang to close the stock market at 4, in what I refer to as an early Occupy Wall Street. He had, as the crowd went as far as the voice could reach. And so he's out at the Patterson strike. I live in Jersey now, and I've spoken many times at the Botto House, which is the American Labor Museum. And there's Harrison with Gurley Flynn and Big Bill Haywood. So he's very involved in this stuff. But around 1914, he gets very disenchanted with the Socialist Party. Lots of reasons, which I describe. But basically, he thinks that the labor movement and the socialists put the white race first before class. And I say that I think this is one of the most important but least heeded criticisms in the history of the US left. Too bad we didn't have his words circulating for many years before this. A couple of other things, actually, before I leave the Socialist Party, and you break me, Ty.
Yeah, let's pause there and
sorry, Brent.
There's a lot more to say. You didn't get far.
More to say.
We haven't even gotten to volume 2.
Yeah, warming up.
But we'll come back. I mean, we'll have time for that. Professor Edwards, Brent, I'd love for you to say a couple words. Jeff talked about Du Bois, about Booker Washington, and he didn't mention Marcus Garvey yet, but we know that Harrison will go on to partner with Garvey and then be critical of him. A. Philip Randolph, in the quote I read beginning of the introduction, called Harrison the father of Harlem radicalism, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on not whether one or the other is the true father here, but how his legacy or activities are distinct from the others.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, just what a pleasure it is to be here and to be able to celebrate Jeff's accomplishment. I mean, to dedicate decades to making an argument for the significance of an intellectual, and I just doing some weight training this evening. Here are the 2 volumes and the reader. This doorstop of an accomplishment is an argument for us that we have to recognize the importance of. I can't think of an equivalent of a figure who's this central, who's this influential, but has been neglected and understudied and underconsidered to the degree Harrison is. So it's just nice to be able to hold the pile and celebrate what Jeff has been able to do in bringing Harrison back before our eyes. Just to respond quickly, I mean, you can think about it generationally. There's a generation of Black leaders. Booker T. Washington goes back into slavery, as the title of his autobiography, Up from Slavery, reminds us. But there's a generation of Black leaders that come out of the shadow of Reconstruction. Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson. They're born in the 1860s and 1870s. The new Negro generation, the generation that really is central to the efflorescence of cultural and political activism in New York in the 1920s, in the interwar period, it starts with Arturo Schomburg, who's born in 1874, and Harrison, who's born in 1883. And if you think about it, Harrison's at the forefront of that. Alain Locke is born in 85. Marcus Garvey is born in 1887. Claude McKay is born in 1889, and A. Philip Randolph, 1889. Harrison is the elder, the mentor to that generation of new Negro Black radical intellectuals that come out of the 1880s. And everybody, all of them, as you said, the father of Negro of Harlem Radicalism, that's A. Philip Randolph, but all of them, W.A. Domingo, Chandler Owen, McKay, J.A. Rogers, Cyril Briggs, Grace Campbell, Richard B. Moore, they all acknowledge the brilliance and the formative influence of Harrison. They all say, this guy set the template, this guy set the tone, and this guy went beyond what most of the rest of us did. In terms of Garvey, Jeff can go into much more detail and does in the second volume of the biography than we can do quickly here. But you could say that Harrison sets the stage for Marcus Garvey and the emergence of the UNIA, Garvey's Back to Africa movement. Harrison literally introduces Marcus Garvey to Harlem, introducing him the first time Garvey gives a talk, actually a block away from where I'm sitting, where I live in Harlem, at a church on 132nd Street. But you could also say that Harrison is not just a framer and introducer, a facilitator, he's integral to building the Garvey movement as a popular movement, especially as the editor of the Negro World, of the UNI newspaper, but also as, more than anyone, the builder of what Harrison himself, in his book When Africa Wakes, he calls the mental background of the new politics of the new Negro. Harrison built that. And Garvey, if anything, derived it from Harrison's thought. The phrase race first, that's Harrison. The very idea behind Back to Africa, it comes, a lot of these ideas that we associate with the UNIA and Garvey actually come from Harrison. But you could also say, just to go one step further, that he goes far beyond Garvey and Garveyism, and what Harrison eventually comes to see as Garvey's limitations, both personally and politically. As Jeff was saying, he's a socialist activist, he's an internationalist in a serious way, not just a vanguardist and patronizing way, in the way you could describe both Garvey's Back to Africa movement and Du Bois's Pan-Africanism as both as different sorts of elitist internationalisms. Harrison really wanted to link up with nationalist movements elsewhere. When he founded the Liberty League in the summer of 1917, the first thing in When Africa Awakes, the great little book that he published a couple of years later, he says that at that founding meeting, they sent a telegram to the Jews of Russia to congratulate them as an oppressed minority in that context, finding their rights or being granted their rights, and hoping that the African American would be granted our rights in the US. So he's an internationalist in the sense of building international ties. And he's a radical in the sense of political militant radicalism in a way that goes beyond Garvey and Du Bois in this period of Du Bois's life. Du Bois had a much longer career because Harrison died so early. When Du Bois in the teens during World War I is calling for writing an editorial in The Crisis, in the newspaper he edited, that saying that African Americans should forget our special grievances to close ranks and support the national interest in World War I. Hubert Harrison, in the wake of the East St. Louis riots, the horrific, bloody riots in 1917, Hubert Harrison is calling for armed self-defense. Hubert Harrison says, if white men are to kill unoffending Negroes, Negroes must kill white men in defense of their lives and property. So he goes way beyond in the radicalism of his politics, way beyond where any of his peers are, wherever you look in his career up till his death toward the end of the 1920s. I could say more because of the other facets of his career. Maybe we can go back to Jeff and get the rest of the outline, but the other facets of the career are also part of it. He does so many more things than his peers do. He's a street speaker, he's a bibliophile, he's an editor, he's a writer, he's an educator, a lecturer. He does such a wider variety of things than many of his peers do. That's the quick answer. There aren't quick answers with Hubert Harrison.
Yeah, wonderful. It's true. When I got the PDF of this book and saw that it was 953 pages, I wondered where the rest of it was, because I knew that Jeff wasn't going to leave any stone unturned. Jeff, I want to hear the rest of the sort of précis of his career, but maybe you can frame it as part of this story, because to me, what's so fascinating here and what makes this project unique is the way that your life and career is so intertwined with the Harrison story now. And on your website and in conversations, I know that you really think of yourself as an independent scholar, and you've worked on the work of other independent scholars. Harrison was an instructor affiliated with the New York Public Library for a while, but he certainly was an independent scholar himself. You both share this bond over being mail carriers. I'm not sure if you were an actual mail carrier, but working in the Postal Service. And I'd love to hear the origin story of how you first came to hear of Harrison, and what in his story made you think that this would be a worthy subject of a many decades long odyssey. I'm sure you probably didn't know that that was what you were embarking on at the time, but do you remember when you first heard of him? Yes. And what the attraction was?
Yes, I do. And very briefly, I'll try. I'm a product of the 60s, influenced greatly by the civil rights, Black liberation struggle, and the anti-war movement. I'm politicized by that. And in the late 60s, early 70s, I met a fellow named Theodore W. Allen, who, for those not familiar with him, pioneered class struggle-based white skin privilege analysis, very different from that which emerges in the 80s, and also wrote the very seminal 2 volumes on the invention of the white race, which I edited new edition for Verso. And I got familiar with Allen's work. And a couple of things in Allen he kind of pointed me towards were the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy, and how white supremacy and white skin privileges were really not in the class interest of laboring class European Americans. That's not what you hear out here very much today. But it was, that it wasn't in their interest. So what happened was, I started out trying to address the question in the late 70s at Columbia for my PhD on why no efforts at radical social change in the US were more successful, focusing on white supremacy. I thought I knew where the answer was. And I did that under Nathan Huggins and Hollis Lynch, 2 outstanding scholars. Huggins left right after I started working with him, and he went up to he was the first head of the Du Bois Institute, I believe. But he stayed, kept me as, his advisee, if you will. And Hollis Lynch, who still lives not far from Columbia, I believe, and has, he's got family active in New York. And they were wonderful, wonderful advisors. And I was working under them, and as I'm doing some research, I read something by Philip Foner in one of his books, and he has a chapter on this fellow named Hubert Harrison. And I look him up and I say, who is this Hubert Harrison? So I go to Schomburg Center. I'll make this quick. Go to Schomburg Center. Back then, you want to read something, you got to print it out on microfilm, through all the labors. And I went home and I read it, and I was totally arrested, because he was the clearest thinker of the early 20th century thinkers, I thought, on questions of race and class. Winston James, who I was friends with and spoke with, said he had the same reaction when he first read Harrison. So I set out to write more and find out more about Harrison. And making this story very brief, in the early 80s, you could send the same letter, change the address. This was a big innovation, and send it to 25 different places. It was pre what we have now, but it helped. And I sent responses, and I got responses from the Virgin Islands saying, well, a librarian in St. Thomas said, I'm related to the family, and his son is in Harlem on 150th off Bradhurst, and his daughter's up in Yonkers. And they gave me the address. So I went and met them. And on the third meeting, they took me into the back room of a railroad apartment. And they said, here are his papers. Do with these what you need to do. I was overwhelmed that they trusted me. I had given them a few chapters. And so I took them back. I became an archivist overnight. You would have been proud of me, Ty. I got the acid-free paper, the archival boxes, I had to learn the vocabulary even, but I did that. And every day while I'm working in the post office, because I'm a postal activist in this period, we're leading strikes against apartheid and, fighting all kinds of battles in the workplace. And so I do this work, and I wind up getting my dissertation done. That's pretty big, and it goes up only to 1917 or 1918. Huggins says, "Jeff, you got to stop it." And as I'm going for my orals, I finished my orals. We had good people on the orals committee too, and I take Harrison's daughter, who's 75, out to B. Smith's restaurant. If you know B. Smith's restaurant, it used to be under 50. I don't know if it's still there. A little high priced for me, but it was good. And as we're talking, at the end of the meal, she reaches down and she goes, "Here, Jeff." She goes, I go, "What is this?" He goes, "It's his diary." For a biographer, I didn't even know what to make of it. So I took it back. And as I did with everything with Harrison, I immediately made copies. And I didn't work from the originals anymore after that, because I'm not so expert at how to handle these things. And I worked from my copies. And as I went through it, I realized I had a giant biography. I had gone to a historians convention around early 1890. My dissertation was finished late 1980s, around 1990. LSU said they wanted to publish it. I said, fine. When I sent them in the copy, it was big, it was long, and they didn't know what to do with it, because the outside readers thought it was excellent, but they were looking for 300 pages. I guess that's par for the course oftentimes. I said, no, I got to do this. So that's the background for how I came on him. But it was from that background, and it was that what interested me was Harrison understood that white supremacy was central to how the ruling class ruled, and it had to be taken on. Priority. A lot of the groups on the left today, they'll list what they stand for, what they're opposed to, and you go down the list, and number 7, oh, we're opposed to white supremacy. It wasn't that way with Harrison. He was crystal clear, and that it was not in the interest of working people, this setup. So sorry for that long-winded response.
No, that was great. So you've mentioned the discovery of the archive, and that's really the third part of this conversation tonight. The archive is extensive, and it features a few volumes of his diary, which are several hundred pages long, periodicals and clippings from newspapers that he saved and commented on, a great selection of photographs of him and of people he knew, and also his clippings, his writings. And so, Brent, I'd love to hear you, as someone who has used this archive and has taught with it, probably more than anyone else other than Jeff. Harrison described his diaries as, in some sort, a history of myself twisted of 2 threads: what I do and what I think. And this would be sort of a 2-part question, because Harrison also claimed to be, and I'm sure it's true, the first literary critic and book reviewer in writing in African-American newspapers. And to me, it seems like that part of his legacy is distinctive and sets him apart from some of the other purely political figures. And so I'd love to hear you talk about Harrison as a writer, about those diaries, his literary criticism, or any piece of that interests you.
Well, I could talk that's 2 potential doors. I could certainly talk about him as a writer. He is a pioneering theater and book reviewer. In some ways, he again invents a space of contemporary theater reviews that, in terms of the Black press in New York in that period, in the early 20s, doesn't really exist. He invents it and uses the venues, not just the Negro World, Marcus Garvey's newspaper, but The Voice, The New Negro. He's a periodical intellectual. He's an editor, and he thinks through periodicals. And one of the space that he shapes as much as anyone else is reviewing. So books and theater especially. And as a writer, I'm dying. I have to read the first thing in the Reader, the very first thing in the Reader. But just to go back to what Jeff was saying about the way Harrison strikes you, the brilliance leaps off the page, and you can imagine him as a street speaker. This is in 1904. He's 21. This is a guy, an autodidact. He's working in the post office and studying at night. And the New York Times, after a race riot, prints in Manhattan, prints an editorial calling African Americans chicken stealers. And Harrison writes a letter to the editor. He's like, I'm offended. I'm going to write a letter to the editor. And if I can just read a little bit of it, I think the tone of his brilliance as a writer just leaps off the page. An editorial expresses the opinion of the newspaper in which it appears. Therefore, a mere reader may justly take offense at an editorial which heaps insults and indignities on his race. Such an editorial was the one in today's Times on gamecocks in New Jersey. I, sir, am a Negro, and strange as it may appear, I am proud of it. In the name of my race, I resent the indignity which your editorial has put upon us. The editorial expressly stated that Negroes of any age, sex, or previous condition of servitude have been wont to steal chicken since the days of Ham and Noah's Ark. I may remark that the Noah's Ark story, far from being a fact, is an impossible myth. And I refer the writer to Professor Huxley's lay sermon critiques and addresses. I would also submit that any man of ordinary intelligence can prove from the Christian Bible itself that Ham, if there ever was a Noah, was not a Negro at all. This narrows the chicken stealing period considerably. And when I point out that under the tribal governments of Africa, chicken culture was a thing unknown, it is narrowed still more closely. I would also point out that in the West Indies, where fowl are plenteous, chicken stealing is much less common than suicide is here. Therefore, it cannot be true that all Negroes are prone to steal fowls, nor that some Negroes have been wont to do so since the days of the wine-bibbing Noah. I, as a Negro, can have no objection to a bit of news that reports a Jersey Negro, or many Jersey Negroes, as being dexterous stealers of chicken. But I strongly object to the sweeping opinion of any newspaper that we are a race of thieves, either of fowls or of anything else. It's that's the first thing. That's the beginning. It's incisive. It's serious. It takes something ridiculous as serious to enact a critique, a devastating critique, and you can see how the erudition and the intelligence lends itself to the force of the critique. But it's also funny. He's got an incredible sense of humor. Claude McKay talked about his ebony hard sense of humor. He would rip you apart on 135th Street in Lenox, but laugh while doing it. And all that is in his writing. Jeff quotes quite liberally from the writing in both volumes, but also the Reader, I think, is indispensable for that quality too. It gives you a sense of him as an intellectual on the page that is almost unparalleled, again, in the period. I went for the writing rather than the archive. I can say more about the archive if you want me to in my class, but let Jeff get in a word and say some more about Harrison.
Great.
Well, you did come to my class. I can say more about my class.
Well, let's. I'm going to move right now to show a couple of documents from the archive. So this will be a chance.
That would be great. Yeah.
We're going a little bit different. We'll do kind of a speed round. I'll put up a document, and either of you can weigh in. For others out there, please put your questions in the Q&A. There's already several in there, and shortly we will be able to transition to asking your questions. And so please continue to put questions in the Q&A, and I'm watching them. All right, are you seeing my screen?
Very well.
So here,
Ty,
yes.
If you can just go back for one, I don't mean to interrupt all the time, but that cover photo, so people know what it is. It's Harrison, your first photo.
Yep, I'm going to go back to that photo. I have the original photo in here.
Yeah, later on. Okay, it's Harrison teaching problems on a course on world problems of race on 135th Street in 1926. Outstanding activists in Harlem, as Brent had pointed out. They're all in the audience. If you go through the audience, you know. Sorry.
We're going to see it in a bit.
Okay.
So here is the cover of volume 2 of the diary. Just a notable piece of material culture. You can see that it's written on just a totally standard composition book. And his scrapbooks that I don't think I have a picture of, often repurposed copies of the Saturday Evening Review, Saturday Evening Post. And so, Brent, I know you've worked a lot with the kind of materiality of these materials, how they show the way information was organized in a pre-digital way. Scrapbooks and the collections are filled with people who in this period were organizing their thoughts in scrapbook form. Let's just skip to the next one. So so what is this, Jaffer?
Yeah, Jeff, I don't think you mentioned this part of the career, the voice and the New Negro. Maybe you should say a little bit about the New Negro.
Okay. Yes, Harrison. Harrison is, you know, I argue in the book, and it's pretty clear, is the pioneer leader of the militant New Negro movement, right? His Liberty League and his voice in 1917. Then in 1919, he edits this publication entitled The New Negro. In 1920, he publishes When Africa Awakes. But unless you get the edition that I put out recently with Diasporic Africa Press, let me just get it here, which is this small one, you might not realize that it's subtitled The Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World. Of course, another version that's out there has elided that title portion of the title page. So Harrison's doing all these things on the New Negro consciously. This is 6, 7, 8 years before Alain Locke. But if you read the major canonical texts that are out there, Harrison, for the most part, in the early stuff was not mentioned at all. And then when he's mentioned in later stuff, sometimes a lot of his articles are dated later, and it's not an accurate portrayal of his role. But here, this is the New Negro. This is September. The first issue that he edited was August of 1919. And the need for it being race consciousness, racial consciousness. And that's what one of his major essays in this issue is. And then he writes about Negro culture colleges. You'll also see down towards the bottom, at least I see it on my screen, the situation in India. Harrison's a great internationalist, as was pointed out. And I have a good quote later on I want to share with you about Harrison as an internationalist. But I received comments from scholars in India saying that the articles that Harrison wrote on India, particularly ones in the New Negro around 1919, were some of the very best they've seen coming out of the US at that point in time. I mean, he's really good, you know? So it's a magazine of a different sort. This is a very good choice, Ty.
All right, next one.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's anything specific about this, but just showing him here as the featured speaker in a kind of a political meeting in Indiana.
Yeah,
so,
one, if I may, one thing on that. He tours the Midwest in this period, 1924. And part of his effort was, you know, one of the things, my subtitle, Struggle for Equality. And boy, did I struggle over what would be the title of the book, because there's so many dimensions of Harrison. But one theme that is throughout his years is the struggle for equality. And at one point, he prepares a little session for high school students in Washington, D.C. And he talks about basically what would be the message actually to returning soldiers. And it was the notion that if we're given a chance to earn a decent living, and, you know, equal opportunity in employment and equal opportunity in politics. You know, we're not being denied the vote, and he says we can take it from there a little bit. So in this effort, when he goes to 1924, it's part of his commitment. This is the period after he's started working with his last formation, the International Colored Unity League. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to try and take the burden off the African Americans down south. So the Klan was raising its ugly head in Indiana, and he went out there to take them on a little. He also, I just mentioned, I wrote a letter to my local paper yesterday because I'm in Jersey. He came out here, for those familiar with New York, New Jersey area, when they burned the cross on Garrett Mountain right outside Patterson, you know, a few years before this. And Harrison came out and challenged them openly to debate. He had a lot of courage. He had a lot of heart too. But so that was part of his tour in 1924.
All right, thank you, Jeff. I don't know, Brent, if you've looked at this, and this is just the sort of top half of the first page.
Yeah, I mean, both with Kipling and also with Stoddard. I mean, this is also something that Jeff documents extensively. He's reading just with extraordinary breadth and responding to mainstream opinion of all stripes. So here's his, okay, Mr. Kipling, the white man's burden. Let me respond with the black man's burden. It's a great, he did write poetry as well. It's a great little poem.
Yeah, just to pick up on this, this is from originally from 1915. He publishes it, but then he published it a few times later, publishes it in some of the publications. But Harrison interacted extremely well with artists, poets, painters, actors, actresses, musicians, and poetry was he started Poetry for the People in a lot of the journals he did. And one scholar, Ethelbert Miller, down at Howard, I think wants to do a major work on Harrison's involvement with poets and poetry. And Harrison writes some poetry himself like this, but he also promotes poets, you know, and it's just wonderful, the breadth and the depth of what he does.
All right. Well, my computer is now pinwheeling on this one here. Let me, I guess we'll have to, I'll have to stop the share now. Hold on one second. All right. So
was it not advancing?
Yeah, I have, unfortunately, the PowerPoint part of this has sort of frozen up on me.
The other thing I would say, just when we started to get a taste of it in those few samples, Harrison is saving himself. He is archiving himself. These fragments, these pamphlets, these flyers, these samples of his publications, they're stuff he's keeping. They come from his own collection. And the scrapbooks are, as Jeff, again, documents at great length in the biographies, the scrapbook are, for Harrison, the scrapbook is the primary archival medium. So he has scrapbooks of he's clipping his own articles, editorials, reviews from places like the Negro World, because a number of these periodicals like The Voice and the Negro World, we can't get it. We don't have a complete run of a lot of these papers anymore. Robert Hill has mentioned that it's a tragedy. The majority of the newspapers of Black radicalism in the interwar period have been lost. We actually don't have the full record of interwar Black radicalism. So Harrison is making an effort in his scrapbooks to keep the record of his own production. And then some of that he collects in his books, in The Negro and the Nation and When Africa Awakes, which are both compendiums of his articles, not just chronological. They're interwoven and divided up by classification in complicated ways. But the other thing to say about his scrapbook, just to go in the direction of the archive, Jeff calls them, in volume 1 of the biography, he calls them a space of self-study for Harrison, and comments on the way Harrison is so intellectually methodical in the way he puts the scrapbooks together. because there are ones that are collections of Harrison's own articles, or like what you just showed, Ty, ads and flyers and posters and postcards for his speaking events, right? He's keeping track of his itinerary. There you go. These are some of the flyers from some of his talks and in-person appearances. But it's not, there's one scrapbook called Mainly About Me. the humor is even in the way he titles his scrapbooks. There's another one I love called, or two actually, called The White Man at Home. But they are mainly about me. There's a lot about Harrison, but there's also a lot of other stuff about thinking international politics, about thinking sexuality, about thinking racial violence and lynching in that moment. It's a mode of thought for him to clip and paste. And you can see he thinks as an editor, he thinks as a newspaper man. So he cuts and reassembles the newspapers around him. Because sometimes what he does in these scrapbooks, the ones that aren't just about his own writing, he takes one piece from the New York Times and juxtaposes it with the piece from a very different sort of newspaper, with a Black newspaper that the readers of the New York Times might not actually be looking at. So the scrapbooks, to me, are a space of thinking. Jeff calls them a space of internal system building. He's making connections on the page in this fascinating way. And that's what my students always respond to, because you can see it. You can see the way he lays stuff out. That there's a reason that he puts this next to that. You can see the connections that he's making as he saves stuff. So it is a collection of his own stuff, of his own career and his own writing, but is also a much broader kind of medium for thinking, almost training the mind, the scrapbook. And that's why they're exciting to teach with and for my students to dive into and page through.
Yeah, there's an important insight here about how the technologies of information can really shape the way people organize their thoughts. In the age of full text searching, the art of browsing is often lost. And the idea that you couldn't actually access a newspaper article or any piece of information a day after its publication, unless you are scrapbooking it or participating in a clipping service, is totally foreign to the way we gather information now. But you can see how it would be, excuse me, so crucial for the way Harrison organized his publications and his thought. So here is the syllabus, Jeff, for the World Problems of Race course, and I'll show the photo next. And it's just
stunning subjects, stunning subjects. If people take time to just look at that for a second, you know, wow. The scope of, you know, what he teaches about. In the same period, he's teaching about China and yeah, NYU and at Columbia, giving lectures on China in the same period. But go on, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, just that this is such a surprising document. And if you were to tell students to come up with 10 bullet points for a course on the world problems of race, you would probably see something very different. And I'll just show the photo that Jeff was referring to.
Yeah. And in this photo, if I may, the fellow in front with a book right in front of Harrison is W.A. Domingo, who worked with Harrison in the Liberty League and was an early editor of the Negro World and active in many other activities. Thanks, Ty. Good. And very important figure in that period. When I'm looking at it, the far left with a book in hand over here, far left, go all the way over this way, Ty. Yep. That's Richard. Oh, I don't want you to lose it. Come back down. That is Richard B. Moore, who's one of the outstanding activists of his era. He early in the Socialist Party, later in the Communist Party, follows Harrison in all these, has a number of wonderful quotes about Harrison in the book. Some I opened the book with, some in the last chapter after Harrison's death. And in later life, besides doing stuff in the Caribbean, you know, for Federation and different movements like that, he and his papers for the archivists in us were donated to down to in Barbados, because that's where he's from originally. Major collection was placed down there. But his daughter, Joyce Moore Turner, is still alive. She's 100 years old. She's a friend of mine. I spoke with her yesterday for about 45 minutes. She just had an article published in Journal of Caribbean Studies in August. Stunning. And it was on Ethelbert Brown, who is the fellow who founds the Hubert Harrison Memorial Church after Harrison dies in 1928. And Joyce is totally mentally alert. And she's somebody, you know how you find people that you throw your ideas off, or you ask them to take a read of this little section or something. She is one of those people I have total confidence will shoot straight. And she and her husband worked on some books. She did Caribbean Crusaders of the Harlem Renaissance and Richard B. Moore, two more names right away. In the front, I believe right here over Harrison's head is Williana Jones Burroughs, who was a public school teacher in New York. Right there, that woman, yes. And she marries Charles Burroughs. She was Williana Jones. She goes to the Soviet Union in 1928. And then again later during World War II, she's got a radio show over there when they were our allies, you know, during World War II. And her, again, family starts the museum in Chicago. And in the very back, I believe the woman straight back with the hat and the crossback, I believe that's Hermie Weiswood, if my pronunciation is correct. And she's also with her husband, Otto Weiswood, is very active in the international communist movement. And I look for the old timers to come forward, and maybe you two can help as we continue to dig deeper and people can identify some things. On that topic, just one last thing. Harrison gave 3 talks on radio while he was alive. He was pre-TV and pre-radio for the most part, but he was a master of mass communication, speaking on the streets, writing for publications and things like that. But he did do 3 radio programs, and I believe they are in the Edison archives in New Jersey, but there's over 1 million uninventoried items. So I've never been able to track down anything, but it would be great if we could locate his voice and his recording of his talk. And they're mentioned, each of these talks are mentioned in volume 2. And, you know, my basis for that, you know. Sorry.
All right. So Jeff, you know, so much of the Harrison story, the story about his legacy, is about the tragedy of his untimely death after appendicitis. He died at the age of 44 in 1927, and that has shaped, as we've said, how he was remembered and how his story was lost. Jeff, can you speak? I mean, I want to get to the questions as soon as possible, but Jeff, can you speak briefly about the reaction in Harlem to?
Yeah, for Harlem activists, for prominent Harlem activists and the common people, there were thousands of people attended his funeral in Harlem. And the eulogies came from Moore and Schomburg and various people. And Schomburg said, and I close my opening chapter with Schomburg's quote at the funeral service. He said, he knew how popular Harrison was in his day, but he said, Hubert Harrison was ahead of his time. And that's why what we have here, and with people like you, Brent, and you, Ty, carrying on, you know, this message can be brought to current and future generations. And and they praised him highly. Here, Edgar Gray, editor for Harrison's Voice, for officer of the UNIA, wrote for Negro World, et cetera, and some of the Black weeklies in New York. Hodge Kiernan from Montserrat wrote again for a lot of the leading Black weeklies. Richard B. Moore, I mentioned before. William Pickens, a high officer in the NAACP, but has several quotes in volume 2 eulogizing Harrison as a street speaker, you know, where he calls him the Black Socrates when he's speaking. W.A. Domingo, I mentioned. Rabbi A. Josiah Ford was from the Jewish people of African descent, right? Miss A.E. Hendrickson is from the Virgin Islands, and she's there. And Ernestine Rose, if people are not familiar with her, She was a librarian at the Schomburg Center and very instrumental for having Harrison, bring materials. There are two more items. Domingo's wife is the pianist, right? And when Harrison donated books with Schomburg. Harrison used to speak every week at the 135th Street Library. He and Schomburg were on the founding committee, which grew into the Schomburg Center. Around this time, and this may have been a day, I'd have to go check my dates, when they had an activity, they placed his photo in the main lobby of the 135th Street Library. I mean, he was eulogized, but shortly around this period and shortly thereafter, other forces started to step back and not keep his memory alive for various reasons, Sorry.
So Brent, just my last question before I get to the Q&A. We've talked about how the story was lost and the kind of triumph and the accomplishment of this rediscovery. What to you does the addition of Harrison's body of work to the canon, that might be premature, but to the conversation today, add to that conversation? What do you feel like is new to learn and consider when you add Harrison's voice back to this history?
Well, it's another piece of the story that we need to know. I mean, we need to know the brilliance and the radicalism of an intellectual of this sort, who's not coming out of, in contrast to a Du Bois, as great, as towering as Du Bois is, not coming out of the elite Western institutions of higher education and the elite halls of civil rights activism, as Du Bois and Alain Locke in different ways were. Du Bois's magazine, The Crisis, is the NAACP house organ. Alain Locke's Opportunity, the Urban League. So they're institutional men. Harrison as an extramural figure, as a street speaker, or Ralph Crowder talks about this generation of great orators and street activists as street scholars. Because what's cool about this moment to me is that the bibliophiles are the ones, are the soapbox orators. The book collectors and the archivists who are going to collect things that aren't collected by the mainstream canonical sources are going to make their own repositories. That determination, which is also the determination of a Schomburg, who went out and built his collection that then was acquired by the New York Public Library, that determination is Harrison's determination. So he's another part of, it's not a completely different story, but it's a crucial key, as we've been arguing tonight, central part of the story of 20th century Black activism across the board, and of self-determining Black intellectual work in Harlem in particular. So, I mean, there's much more that you could say in terms of the current moment and the relevance of Harrison's career and the kind of militancy of Harrison's political stance in relation to the moment of Black Lives Matter and the pandemic that we are sitting in at a safe distance. There's a lot more that we could say, but that's just to speak briefly to the historical significance.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've had some great questions from the audience. I'm going to choose some from there. All right, so here's a question from James Morgan III. And the question is, what was it about their island upbringings that caused Harrison, Garvey, and Schomburg to become the radical figures that they became? And that is a crucial question, I think, to Jeff or to Brent, about how the Caribbean roots of these scholars in this time period factored in their interactions with US culture and politics.
I'm gonna go, Brent, or I have something on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And I talk about this in volume 1 particularly. I have a long chapter on Crucian roots and in a lot of my talks. But essentially, the color line was drawn differently, if you will, in the Anglo-Caribbean and in the US. In St. Croix, for instance, where Harrison grows up, the basic demographics were there was 5% European ruling elite, 80% plantation workers, 15% people in between, so-called mulattoes, or however it's phrased, in general, right? In order to maintain social control, the 5% couldn't do it by themselves, so they tried to utilize those people in the middle. And that was different than the US, where in order to maintain social control, the real ruling elite used laboring and poor European Americans, right? And so some of the manifestations of these differences were that St. Croix has no history of lynching. US has vicious lynching, the white supremacy. St. Croix has a policy of promotion of a sector of the African descended population. US doesn't really have that. And in St. Croix, there's an edict of full equality that's passed in the 1850s, which at least nominally gives full rights to people of some people of African descent, whereas in the US, we have the Dred Scott decision. So it's a qualitatively different atmosphere, and it's somewhat similar in Barbados and Jamaica. Now, that means when Harrison's growing up, limited as they were, Harrison has some educational opportunities that do not exist down south, right? African Americans just don't have access to this stuff. Reading is an issue, a serious issue. And so that, that's a very important component of it all. And I know I've read, and I think this is accurate, when the Afro-Caribbeans come here, when they have their study groups, their lyceums in the West 50s, it's a freewheeling intellectual debates and things like this. They're a healthy, component of all of this stuff. So that's some of what I think the issues are. Brent, you might have more to add.
Well, it's not just about the island upbringings, it's the migrant experience as well. It's about the shock, as Jeff was just starting to say, of these individuals coming from those environments and being confronted with the rampant and relentless segregation and racial violence of the context in the US. The shock of that radicalized a number of these figures. And the other thing I'd say about it is that we don't want to homogenize island upbringing because, Marcus Garvey and Claude McKay are both Jamaican, but they have very different political outlooks and intellectual worldviews. Harrison, Garvey, and Schomburg, just to stick with the three in the question, and Schomburg in particular from the Hispanophone Caribbean, they really come from literally different places and from different understandings of the world and different understandings of political dynamics. So I wouldn't want to say too quickly that it's some sort of essential Caribbean quality that simply catalyzes a political radicalism, because we can think of plenty of other trajectories. To me, just to give one bibliographic reference, the great work directly on this subject that you have to read if you haven't is Winston James's book, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, which has a chapter on Schomburg. It's one of the first places that I read an in-depth chapter on Harrison, a good portion on Garvey, and it really thinks about the political forces that shaped this generation of Caribbean intellectual migrants. So that I'd recommend Winston's work in particular.
So I think there's something of a Rorschach nature to Harrison for those of us who are interested in this time period. My research is on early 20th century anarchist and radicalism, and I know that Harrison was often described as an anarchist as well as a socialist, and so I would be interested to hear what his links were like with Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. But there's a series of questions here about, did Harrison know this person? So I'm going to read out a few of them, and you can choose which one you want to tackle. There's a question: has there been a link established between Harrison and CLR James? There's questions about his relationship to Marcus Garvey. Someone wants to know if he's was connected with the freethinker Robert G. Ingersoll. Another audience member wants to hear about his relationships with Eugene O'Neill. One person asked if there was any chance that Harrison crossed paths with the person who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh. And then a question about Harrison and Du Bois. So we're not going to get to all of those, obviously, but between James, Ho Chi Minh, or Ingersoll or O'Neill, and then maybe we'll set aside Du Bois for a further discussion. But have you come? Well, let me pause and see if any of those sparked anything for you, Jeff.
You want to go, Brent, or no?
I would just turn to your index. You may know some of the specific answers.
This time I didn't do the index. They did. First time I did my index. Well, volume 1, I did the index. But Ingersoll, he read a lot of Ingersoll in answer to that. O'Neill, he had some important correspondence with, and that's in volume 2. And I quote O'Neill, even in the opening chapter, where O'Neill writes something to the effect to him to tell the story of the person, not to just propagandize them. That's what counts, And that was one of the things that helped me get focused on the biography I was trying to write. I drew from Harrison's diary, where he writes, "As it happens, I'm going to record it. I'm not going to try and shade it or hide things." And I quoted from O'Neill and from Rogers. Rogers says, "No man is perfect to his valet, but that doesn't deny the essential greatness of Harrison." So yeah, Harrison, you're going to see some flaws in Harrison too, but the story's well worth telling. Garvey is major discussion of Harrison and Garvey throughout volume 2. Major, and this is going to be, I believe, eye-opening for many people, for what it says about then, but even for what it might say about today, if you think about it a little bit. And C.L.R. James, no, I do not know of any contact with C.L.R. James.
C.L.R. James is younger and didn't go to England until the end of the 20s. They couldn't have crossed paths because Harrison dies too soon.
Other than the first time I think I met Brent was at this people doing a C.L.R. James Institute or something way back, and they've been maintained interest in Harrison. This goes back years. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah. The other one I don't have an answer to it, but it's an interesting conjecture that Ho Chi Minh, as far as we know, came through New York before he ended up in Paris, also in the late teens, around 1917. But it's a murky period in terms of the documentation of Ho Chi Minh's early career that I've written a little bit more focused on the Paris part of that. It's really interesting to imagine Ho Chi Minh and Hubert Harrison meeting on some street corner, or Ho Chi Minh hearing Hubert Harrison on a soapbox in Harlem. Ho Chi Minh does say later in his career that he went through Harlem and was exposed to political activism in New York, but he doesn't name names, so that I don't know how one would document that, but it's an interesting idea.
Great. Volume 3, Jeff.
Volume 3?
To be
Volume 3.
I proposed that, believe it or not, but they cut me off. So and there was much more to volume 2, I can assure you.
So we have 2 questions. Oh yeah, we have 2 questions about Du Bois, and I think maybe a couple words on that relationship. One by Daryl Miller, who asked about Du Bois potentially having some prejudice against people from the Caribbean. And then another question just asking about the relationship. I mean, I guess Du Bois does seem like a comparable figure and a kind of a Renaissance person in the same way that Harrison was. What stands out to you, Jeff, about their relationship, other than the conflict over the joint rights?
Right. Early on, Harrison started to distance himself from Du Bois's philosophy of the talented 10th who should be made leaders of the race. He thought he didn't agree with that. He didn't think, having a drop of white blood preordained anybody to leadership. And even more important, he thought that the NAACP, which Du Bois was writing for and working with, had no answer to the question, what are you going to do if these white people, if you will, you're trying to reach, don't respond in a positive way? They had no answer. He also, the question of Du Bois and Harrison gets at another issue which I talk about in the book and has relevance for today. And it's the question of the funding of people, how they get their funds. Money was often, all the time, a problem for Harrison. And Du Bois was getting funded by the NAACP, mostly by Spingarn in particular, financed Du Bois quite a bit. Got some money from the Garland Fund, which was a nonprofit, if you will, as did Randolph and Owen. Briggs got money from the Communist Party, and Garvey found his ways to get money, right? And Harrison, in contrast, when he was offered $10,000 by a white person who wanted to, when I say white, I'm putting it in quotes, by the way, by a white person who wanted to contribute to his efforts, he declined because he said, no, I don't want to have our policies dictated to in that fashion. But so that's a question. And then, so after 1919, there's some exchange of correspondence with Du Bois and Harrison has some comments on him into the early 1920. But then shortly before Harrison dies, and this stuff is available in the Du Bois papers up at UMass Amherst, Du Bois writes to Denmark trying to see if Harrison ever had a doctorate, because in the 20s, he was sometimes being described as Dr. Hubert Harrison. Now, he didn't initially put that forward, but it was being used, and I didn't see him exactly denying it either. He'd go with the flow oftentimes and maybe have an interpretation on it. There was that correspondence, but Harrison didn't know about that, I don't think, in any way.
Harrison was a critic of Du Bois, and
Yeah.
remember that Harrison is the editor of the Negro World. So there's an antagonism both in the intellectual and the political stances, and in the way they're positioned in the political spectrum in that moment. But one thing I'm remembering, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you say this at one point. I think I remember that there's a moment at which Harrison shares some of his scrapbooks with Du Bois, shares clippings with Du Bois.
Yes.
So there is a sense that network, that bibliophile autodidact network, Du Bois is not an autodidact, but that sense of Black intellectuals building their own archives, Du Bois is welcomed into that network and allowed to use some of those resources. And that seems like an important footnote or counterpoint to mention.
Yes, and there's two times I believe it happens. Once is around 1909. I'll have to go back and check, but we could both check. And he sends him some of his notes, I think, on Reconstruction. And what's interesting on that is then Du Bois writes an article in 1910, his first article on the subject of Reconstruction. I believe it's his first article. And later on, his seminal publication, 1935, Black Reconstruction. But Harrison understood the importance of the Reconstruction period back then, and he shared that stuff with Du Bois. And then later on, he might have done a nice review or a nice comment on something that Du Bois had done, and Du Bois in the Negro World, and Du Bois said, "Oh, can we get a copy of that? Can we share copies?" And Harrison sent him, "Can we exchange copies?" One last thing too about the Harrison Du Bois. When Harrison criticized Du Bois during the war, one thing that's very interesting, and I have in volume 2, is the criticism, as Brett pointed out, was about the special grievances issue, right? And the special grievances being lynching, segregation, disfranchisement. And Du Bois said, "Let us forget these special grievances." And Harris said, "No, no, no." But Apteker, who compiled the papers and records of Du Bois, points out that some many years later, Du Bois acknowledged that his critics, like Harrison, in this period, Du Bois acknowledged that they were accurate, they were right, you know, and that's deep, you know.
One other thing, Ty, it's a reminder, this back channel, going back to what you said about media and mediascapes, the politics of different media forms and the periodical in this period, that scrapbooks circulate. And this is one thing you learn by reading Harrison's diary, because he sometimes says things like, last weekend I went out to New Jersey and Miss so-and-so showed me her scrapbook on this topic. These folks are not just collecting clippings in the privacy of their home environments. It becomes a way of sharing material. It becomes an alternate mode of circulating resources among Black intellectuals. And sometimes we think too quickly as the scrapbook is some kind of private space where you're at home making these kind of dainty do-it-yourself artisanal products, but they're actually public repositories. So you would ask Alexander Gumby, the other scrapbooker whose collection I use that's at Columbia, you could go to the Gumby studio and consult his scrapbooks. Scrapbooks are very much a public and circulating form in this period.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think we should say, I think maybe we have time for one more question, but just a reminder to everyone here that the volume 2 is available. It's out, it's been published.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you have a bookseller that you endorse, Jeff?
Say it again. Yes. There, Brent's got a better copy. Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. If people go to Columbia University Press and use the code CUP20, Columbia University Press 20, they can get the book at 20% off discount. And right now, I've been told people are getting it within a few days. I can tell you that I still have not gotten my copy. My sister got a copy the other day and I went rushing over to get this. I mean, I'm supposed to get a number of copies, but I know people started receiving it as far back as 2 weeks ago. And every day I go to the door to see if it's there. And I've received boxes of dog food, you know, and some books from Verso, but not Hubert Harrison yet. One other thing, just because we're on record, when I was pointing about the contrast between the Caribbean, I think it's there are similarities a little bit more with the Anglo-Caribbean and the U.S. than not the similarities, but the contrast, because where Schomburg comes from in Puerto Rico is different again, you know, a whole other dimension. That's why I just wanted to clear that a little bit. And McKay talks about the same thing very much. And I quote Garvey and McKay, but McKay has a stunning quote about when he first comes here and what he encounters. And what Brent pointed out is how essentially Harrison was shocked, you know, when it was lynching, you know, that he wrote that he was shocked when he encountered lynching here in the US. I don't know if you said that specifically, but that's what he wrote, yeah.
So
I want to thank you both. This is one last thing. I want to thank you both so very much because I'm getting old. And as I wrote this, I mean, you can probably tell I wrote it, I put all this work into it because it's written for current and future generations. And I really genuinely believe it's people like you are going to be instrumental in helping to get this out and explain it and develop it and deepen it, whatever happens, you know. But I think you've got a very important role to play, particularly since you're the guardian of the papers, Ty. No, I'm kidding.
Thank you, Jeff. And we have an audience member, Daryl Miller, saying that they're from St. Croix and that they're grateful for you and for this presentation. And that would probably be a good note to end it on. But I do want to ask one last question because I feel like it hasn't quite come out yet, but I would love to hear one of you or both of you talk about Harrison and anti-imperialism as we think about maybe his Caribbean roots, maybe the connections to Denmark or to the sort of politics of his upbringing, but looking back at the world problems of race syllabus and thinking of this period as a age of empires, how did anti-imperialism feature in his analysis?
You got it, Brent, or you want me to go?
If you can do it, I can't do that quickly, but if you have a quick answer, go ahead.
I've got to quote some here. I prepared some stuff, but very briefly. He writes at various places how capitalist imperialism is behind so much of modern war. And he is anti-imperialist, and he documents what that means. And he talks about imperialism. He says, World War I, they hide what they're really fighting over. And he talks about Africa being what they're so interested in. And he's throughout opposed to capitalist imperialism, which he ties into white supremacy, because that's who the leading capitalist imperialists are. And he makes an important point there too. This point gets a little deep, but one of his differences comes with Garvey, who wanted, his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association and Imperial League. Forgive me if I get the title a little mixed up. Harrison wasn't really an imperialist like that. And he had much respect for people of Africa, and didn't want to go there and civilize them, which was another phrase that Garvey used in his early documents. So Harrison, and critical of imperialism, wrote one very powerful article on wanted a new international where peoples of color worldwide would unite. Interestingly, again, for a little something that people can walk away from this with, he originated a tricolor flag. Today, people know the red, black, and green, and they associate it with Garvey, Black liberation struggles. But originally, Harrison's tricolor was black, brown, and yellow. And he said, because that's the colors we are domestically and internationally, peoples of color, if you will. And he said that Garvey then switched to the red, black, and green and gave his reasons for it. But it's interesting, and you can read about this, and Harrison goes into it a little more. I'll let people do their own digging on this.
Brent, do you want to add to that?
I think just briefly, he says in that one of my favorite chapters in When Africa Awakes, his second book, A Compendium of Articles, one of the articles, there's one called A New International, but the chapter that it's in is called Our International Consciousness. And he says, he argues that that the cause of Black nationalism is international, that it's in response, it's not a US-based thing. It's not a sectarian, it's not a parochial thing. It's something that responds to international currents in relation to, as Jeff was just saying, capitalist imperialism around the world in the way that it's inflected racially. What Cedric Robinson has taught us to think about as racial capitalism, that capitalism works through race. It works by manipulating and mobilizing racial difference. Harrison, this is 1915, 1916, 1917. He sees that. And so and that leads him to, it's not a feel-good identity politics sort of position. People of color unite. It's, in fact, his race first. He says, we're race first because you all were race first. Even the Socialist Party, you think Socialist Party, class organizing, class-based organizing is only about the white working class. So we need to be race first in response to that. So the internationalism of the darker peoples of the world, to use a Du Bois phrase for it, it emerges out of that critique, that sensibility that sees the spread of the way the world is carved up by capitalist imperialism and responds to it in kind with a race thinking that is critical in orientation. There's a lot more to say, and I would just recommend starting with this chapter, Our International Consciousness and When Africa Awakes. But it's a persistent thread running from a ludicrously early period, really running from the World War I moment, if not before, and throughout the rest of Harrison's life in a very powerful vein.
Thank you, Brent. All right, I think we can end there. Let me just say for all of the participants and for me, thank you to you both, and especially Jeff, thank you to you for this lifetime achievement and dedication. And I'm hearing from many people already who are stunned to learn about the significance of Harrison just from tonight's program. So I think we can all give you a virtual ovation. I'm going to just give you an actual ovation, and I'm sure I'm being joined by others in the audience. I urge everyone to check out the books, check out the reader, and the Hubert Harrison papers also have a digital project online.
Which are linked to throughout the book. Give total, credo to the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. If I may say one other thing, the number just changed. But when Ty was setting this up with Brent and I, he said he predicted that there would be 50 participants, or that was most likely. And about 30 seconds ago, we were at 50. So Ty, you had this one figured. You did a great job.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Brent, for taking the time. And thank you to all participants.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Good night. Good night.